So this is a really stinky sheep milk cheese from Corsica. Really, really strong. That's why it's got the love the stink on it there. The Timanois is it's a hazelnut liqueur washed cheese from France. If you like that kind of stuff in your cheese kind of thing, it's really nutty.
What if I wanted something just like creamy or buttery?
Oh yeah, well we got the Briat Savarin over here, which is a triple cream French cheese. Really just like luscious, oozy, fatty. A lot of times people come into the store and they say, "Oh my God, you have the best job ever. How do I get into becoming a cheesemonger? How do I do this? Do you go to culinary school? Do you go, do you take special classes? Is there something you do?" And my response to them is kind of, well, the way I became a cheesemonger is because I was a punk rocker. And that sounds kind of confusing, but the way that happened was, I grew up in the Bay Area. And I grew up during the Reagan 80s. There's a whole cultural shift to the right happening, and me and lots of my friends didn't like that, and so where I lived, Bay Area, North Bay, it seemed like becoming a punk rocker was the right thing to do at the time. And I was much more interested in the political punk scene than anything else. I eventually started going to protests and demonstrations, got arrested at the 1984 Democratic Convention, and decided I wanted to do more activism, really. That was the more important part of things for me. So, I was involved in, in various political actions in the 80s, anti-apartheid stuff, Central American stuff. From then, I got to the point where all of a sudden I was in my early 20s and I had to figure out, well, how am I going to make a living? So I live in San Francisco. I've lived in San Francisco since the 80s, and I decided I wanted to work at a place that reflected my values and was some place that would be good to work at. So I decided to work at the country's largest retail worker cooperative, which is Rainbow Grocery Cooperative, and we're a very decentralized, low hierarchy, worker-run collective. Rainbow Grocery has been around since 1975, and we started as part of this thing in San Francisco that's called the People's Food System, and it was kind of a radical attempt to try to change the way that food is distributed and sold. It was a network of worker co-op grocery stores, but it also tried to involve distribution, which there was a warehouse that was distributing these natural foods to these companies, because you got to remember back in 1975 there was no natural foods industry at the time. It was a bunch of people who wanted to get less processed, cheaper, more healthy foods to people, and that was something that wasn't available unless people created it themselves. And it also had a warehouse, had a trucking collective. They were also trying to start some producer collectives at the time. There was even one, my favorite one never got off the ground, so to speak, but it's called Left Wing Poultry, and it was going to be a chicken farm, but that actually never started. But there was a number of other producer collectives and stuff, and unfortunately that fell apart through the in the late 70s as a lot of political movements in the 60s kind of disintegrated. But Rainbow came out of that and managed to survive and thrive over the years. We're a 250-person worker-owned cooperative. Most people are familiar with consumer cooperatives, which are owned by the shoppers. We're owned by the workers. So every worker here has an equal vote and an equal say in what happens in the store. I'm the cheesemonger. I'm the cheese buyer. So in my job description, I have certain decisions that I can make. But those are ones that are agreed on by my department, and they could vote me out tomorrow if they didn't like it. If they didn't like my book, they could have voted me out of the department, I guess. But it's a really interesting place to work, and it's a really it's a large scale experiment in workplace democracy that's really unlike almost anything else I've seen in the country, and it's a great place to work.
You have Drunken Goat?
Oh, we got Drunken Goat right there. You love Drunken Goat?
Favorite cheese.
Yeah, they force feed the goats alcohol, and that's why it's called Drunken Goat. Yeah.
What kind of alcohol?
Wine. Well, it's a wine cheese. No, they rub the outside with wine, and that's why it's purple. So if you like that too, you like the Campo de Montalban or the Manchego.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
What about this one? This one seems interesting.
Oh yeah, this one it's called pata cabra. It means goat foot. Right, so it's really like ugly and nasty looking on the outside, but the inside is really soft, semi-soft. I got hired into the cheese department, but I had no particular love for cheese at the time. It just was where the opening was. This was back in 1994, and we were actually at a different, smaller location. And so I got hired in the cheese department, but it wasn't really it wasn't like the cheese department we have now. It was a couple of doored coolers. It was just, basically inventory taking, ordering, for, your basic commodity jacks, cheddars, etc. And then over the course of time, we, a couple years later, we moved to this much bigger location. And me and a couple other people had to figure out how do we make our cheese department more interesting and have more interesting things, bigger selection and all that. And so that's kind of when I started becoming a cheesemonger. Now, a cheesemonger is someone who buys and sells cheese, but also there's an implied, expertise there. And I certainly bought and sold cheese for a long time before I had much real knowledge about it. I think it's deceptive. There's always more to learn. I still hear things and I'm like, oh yeah, I should have known that. I'm still learning, here it is 16 years later and I'm still learning about cheese. But that was my path to becoming a cheesemonger. I call myself a cheesemonger, but it's kind of because it's catchy. I like that it's an old word. It's got some tradition to it. Like fishmonger, warmonger, cheesemonger. It sounds good. Some people really react badly to cheesemonger. It's funny. One of the few, one of the few online negative reviews I got was somebody who just couldn't get over the fact that I used the word monger, and it really disturbed them. But I like it. I think it's it implies some kind of connection to the old traditions of knowing about what you're selling and being kind of devoted to it. It's funny in the cheese world because there's no certifications for any of this stuff. I mean, I can say I'm a cheesemonger, and anybody can say they're a cheesemonger. But the cheese world tends to have a lot of people with a lot of nicknames for some reason. I think cheese people have a good sense of humor in general. So you've got all sorts of people, like cheese guy, cheese diva, cheese snob. You've got all these people who name themselves all these nicknames, but cheesemonger is a more generic term. One of the reasons I'm really interested in cheese is because I think it's a really political food right now. I mean, I think we're in a time period where people are talking a lot about food politics and a lot about food issues. And the reason that cheese in some ways is a more political thing than most is because of the way that milk is priced in this country. The most fluid milk is sold, it's a commodity, so it's traded, the prices are set in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. People can't just sell their fluid milk for whatever price they want. It's controlled. So therefore, a lot of the small dairies have a harder time competing against, big, large, agribusiness. And one of the ways that they've been able to survive, or those that have been able to survive, is by making cheese. Because what happens when you make cheese is that you can price it according to what it costs to produce it, rather than pricing it by whatever the Chicago Mercantile Exchange decides you have to price it for. So it's something that's really enabled a lot of small farmers to stay on the land. And I think that's just a really important issue for people to know, and that's why it's good to support your small local farmers. I'll give you an example too of one company that's just doing a really amazing thing, which is Jasper Hill in Vermont. Their mission is kind of to support small dairy farming in Vermont. What they've done in that area, it's Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, middle of nowhere. I'm a California kid. I went there for the first time. I didn't understand that there was less people in the whole state than there was in the Bay Area. I just had no idea. But I went there. I was really amazed. But there's the dairy farming up there. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's something like they only have about a third of the dairy farms that they used to have up in that area. And so the Keeler brothers at Jasper Hill decided what they would do is help support small farmers by getting them to go from fluid milk to making cheese, so they'd be able to survive. And to do this, they built these aging rooms, and they're helping people develop cheese, market cheese, because they all will say, aged at the cellars of Jasper Hill, below whatever the farm and cheese name it is, and giving them expertise on how to age cheese. And to me, that's a really interesting development to help support small farmers. People all the time ask me what my favorite cheese is, and I used to say, like, well, if I chose one, the others would be jealous, but but yeah, it's kind of an old joke, But I have a lot of favorite cheeses. It's more of what my favorite cheese of the day is right now. I think that right now my favorites are, there's a brand new organic cheese from Marin, Nicasio Valley, the Nicasio Square from the Nicasio Valley Creamery. I love that. It's like kind of an American Taleggio style, but a little more tangy. Really interesting organic milk. The farm's been around since 1919, but they just started making cheese last week, so that's a nice new cheese. Well, maybe not last week, a couple months ago. I love the Wisconsin Sheep Dairy Co-op, Dante. It's aged American sheep cheese. I love all the cheeses from Jasper Hill. Pretty much everything they put put out. My all-time favorite American cheese, I'd say, is probably the Winnemere. It's a cheese that's washed rind, washed in alambic beer, then it's wrapped with bark, and it just gets this really intense, complex flavor. Real beefiness, real nuttiness, real just complexity. It has almost a mustardy flavor to it. And I don't like to get too fancy in my cheese descriptions, but this is one of the few that's worth, using a lot of adjectives to describe, because there's a lot going on in that cheese. The Sweetgrass Dairy Green Hill is one of my favorite cheeses, soft ripened. It's basically a little brie from cows that are pastured, basically grass fed. It's made in Georgia. It was a bit hard for me to get it, so that I make sure that I get it now. I order directly from them and get shipments every 3 weeks or so, and it's just a great cheese. As soon as we started getting it direct from them in good shape, we can't. I'm out of it right now. We can't sell it. We can't stock it fast enough for that cheese. A couple other cheeses. One that is, it's almost kind of obvious if you're in the cheese world, but a lot of people who don't work in cheese don't know about this cheese, which is the Rogue River Blues. And they come from Oregon. They just took the American Cheese Society competition last year. The overall best was their Rogue River Blue, which is wrapped in leaves that are macerated in brandy, and it's only from a certain time of year. It's a seasonal cheese, and it's just amazing. I mean, the complexity of the flavor in that. It's got that intense blue flavor, but it's got a sweetness to it. It's a pear brandy, so you get that fruitiness to it. Just a really, really amazing cheese. And there's another great blue from Wisconsin that we're just starting to get out here right now. I imagine in Wisconsin you could have gotten it for a while. But it's basically, what it tastes like is it tastes like an aged cheddar with blue veins in it. When we carried, especially the English cheddars, the traditional ones, they often have some blue veining in there. And we've always had a few customers who've been like, oh, I want the cheese that has the, accidental blue veining, because they really like the flavor. Well, this is like that cheese, but it's intentional. And it's called Dunbarton Blue, and it's from Wisconsin. And it's another one that's just been a really great new cheese for us. More and more people are producing cheese in their local areas, and there's a great opportunity for new cheesemakers to be like that person at their farmer's market making cheese wherever they are, whether it's Utah, Idaho, Georgia, wherever. But traditionally, cheese has been made, most cheese has been made in Vermont, in Wisconsin, California, somewhat New York. And I think that's almost changing now. All those states are big producers of cheese, but places like Oregon and Washington, just amazing cheese that's coming from there now. And I wouldn't have said that either because I didn't know it or because these people weren't yet producing, a few years ago. But I went up to the Oregon Cheese Festival this year, and it's just incredible. The level of cheese making, how fast it's arisen in Oregon is really tremendous. But that's kind of popping up all over the country, and it's hard for me. I'm still in California. I'm a Californian. I go travel for cheese conferences and occasional tasting tours and things like that. But I'm sure there's lots of cheese out there that I don't know about. There's a lot of trends in the cheese world. I mean, all of a sudden everybody will want to have like an aged cheddar or a new blue or something like that. But one of the most recent trends over the last couple of years has been home cheese making, and people are really into home cheese making. All of a sudden, we've started carrying rennet and calcium chloride and all the other cheese making things we always used to kind of dabble in, but now it's just a real steady business. And I think it's really great for people to demystify the process and really understand that they can make, maybe not, they can't make like a Parmigiano Reggiano at home, but they can make a nice cheese at home, especially a nice fresh cheese, fairly easily, and with a little more skill, start making more aged cheeses. And I think it's a great development that will actually help everybody, because once people understand cheese, they appreciate it more. There's a different process to make every cheese, so there's a lot of different ways to make cheese. There's simple cheese, things that you can make at home really easy with just a cheesecloth and vinegar. You'll have just like real fresh farmer's cheese if you do that. Some cheese you add mold to and you let ripen, let the mold bloom like a brie, and it gets soft. Other cheeses, when you make the cheese, you have the milk. You add the rennet, so you have curds and whey, like the old saying. Then you generally, if you're making an aged cheese, you'd press those curds. You get rid of the whey, but you press the curds so the cheese can last longer. Some cheese like this, the Parmigiano Reggiano, it's made with raw milk. It's pressed pretty hard because it's going to be really aged cheese. That cheese is about 28 months old right now. And then you have some cheddars and some Goudas that might get aged 4 years or more. There's even a 15-year cheddar out right now. I consider it one of my missions to stop the cheese world from becoming like the wine world. I think that while I understand, the flavor wheel and how all those attributes work, and I think there's certain uses for them, especially professionally, I think in the day-to-day, you're buying wine, you're taking it home, you're serving, you're having a party, you're serving dinner, that stuff is it's just too fancy and too snobby for me. The, most cheese can be described in just a few words. Is it sharp? Is it pungent? Is it oozy? Is it runny? These real basic words. And to me, it's really important to keep cheese down to earth because it's cheese. We like it. We like to eat it, but it doesn't need to be that fancy. I think that there's times when it's worth describing a complex cheese, like say something like the Jasper Hill Windermere, because I can taste that, and there's 8 or 10 different things going on in my mouth at that time. When I eat a regular cheddar, even a great cheddar, there's only going to be a few different flavor attributes to it. So I think it's good to keep it down to earth. And I also think that to be honest, I think that cheese has a lot more to do with beer than it does with wine. There's the fermented properties and all that, but it's also that much like the craft beer movement, which is probably 10 or 20 years ahead of the cheese world, people have really embraced that small production, hometown brewery thing, which is what's happening in the cheese world now, and it's what's really been happening over the last 15 years of my involvement in cheese. That it's becoming you don't want to call them micro creameries, but that's basically what we're talking about here. It's people making small scale cheese for mostly their regional area, and then maybe they'll get a little bigger and start seeing some somewhere else. But to me that's what it's about, and I think cheese really pairs really well with beer, and I just happen to like beer better than wine. Cheese has long been a food that we eat in this country and a lot of other countries. It's something that gives people a lot of pleasure. It's a satisfying food. It actually, provides you with a lot, considering, per ounce, per pound, a lot of nutrition, a lot of filling you up. So it's a really good, food for all those things. I think when I think of culture and cheese, I really do think of preserving rural culture in the United States. I think of it being a way for people to survive in small dairy farms and to keep that way of life viable. So I think that's why cheese is an important food, and I think it's something that a lot of us. It's funny in this country because, I think that, I'm of the generation, I'm about 42 right now, I'm of the generation that grew up with Kraft singles and processed American cheese, which is a really, American invention. That's why it's American cheese. Basically, that stuff is cheddar that's been cooked and emulsified and processed in order to give you a product that lasts a long time. And there's nothing evil about the idea of that. Basically, you're trying to preserve food and you're trying to feed people cheaply, which is kind of what, American food has done, as American culture goes, is tried to make food cheap and feed people. I have, a critique of the way that affects farmers, because it's hard for them to make a living once you get big agribusiness involved. And I have a critique of the flavor and taste. I mean, you've taken a product that, say if we're talking about cheddar, something that grew up in England, had all sorts of, interesting tastes and varieties, and you've homogenized it down to something that barely has any flavor left. But I think that, like I said, my generation grew up, with Kraft singles and Velveeta, and I think that in the last 15 years, there's just been this emergence of a new cheese culture. A lot of people who want to make much more challenging cheeses, interesting cheeses, and cheeses that are rooted in their local area. When we started getting a more what they call specialty cheese department, which means that you have things that are besides Jack and cheddar and Swiss, I would say that, this is back in the mid-'90s, I'd say probably 90%, if not more, of our cheese that was fancy, that was specialty cheese, came from Europe. And back in those days, there was not a whole lot of avoiding that. There wasn't a lot of American cheese that even I could get, even in San Francisco, which is a pretty good market for cheese, that I could get in good shape and be able to sell to customers. And that's totally changed over the last 15 years or so. First we had a local section, then we had a local and American section, and we have to just keep expanding it. I mean, there's, to the point now where, people come looking for American cheeses. They want whatever's new. What are people making these days? What's a new American cheese? And I think it's really great. It's really interesting. I think one of the best things that American cheesemakers did was stop naming their cheese after European cheeses. Even if it's in a similar style, it's going to have a different taste, and it's going to have a different way of production. So, if you're calling your cheese a Wisconsin Gruyere, then people are going to compare it to a Swiss Gruyere. And the Swiss Gruyere, because it's got more price supports and all this kind of thing, and right now the dollar's not doing so well against it, is going to be cheaper. So why do you want to call yourself why do you want to call your brand new cheese something that stacks up against centuries of tradition from someplace else that's going to be cheaper? I mean, it makes no sense at all. So, these days, I think it really makes sense that people they're naming their cheese after the areas they're in or about something that's special to them. And it really helps define them as different cheeses than people are used to, something new to try. And there's a lot of great experimentation and innovation in American cheese right now, and it's really exciting time to be involved in it. For a long time, people who were looking for cheese would come in, and if they knew anything about cheese, they would be like, oh, I want the original European standard. And I got to say, for the first time in the last few years, even, I would say there's a number of cheeses that are made in a style of European cheeses, like say a blue cheese or say cheddar style cheeses that are actually competing with what we would call the original cheeses, because it's from the countries where they're originally made. And I think it's a fabulous development. I mean, I think that you have cheddars like the Cabot cloth-bound cheddar, the Beecher's Reserve, Flagship Reserve. You have the Fiscalini aged cheddar. Those are great cheddars, and they really stack up against the Keens and the Montgomery. The Keens and the Montgomery from England, they have centuries of history, and I think still they have their own distinct flavors. But somebody might actually prefer one of the American ones, and it's not something that you can say you're wrong. You can't say that, no, you're wrong. The Montgomery is the best, cheese for you. You might say it's the one with the most tradition. It's the one that people copy in order to make their own cheese. But, you can't say that it's better for everyone. And I think that that's been a development in the last 15 years or so. Much like in the way that people used to only buy French wine, and now, a lot of people will be California wine, Oregon wine, whatever they prefer. And, there's a lot of preference in there. And it's, you can't tell somebody that they're wrong about what they like to eat in terms of taste. This book project really started when I started writing a blog. I'd always had little writing projects here and there. I worked on a zine for different zines for a while. I did, zine reviews for Maximum Rock and Roll. I did all sorts of other writing. I sold a few articles here and there. But I started a blog in 2002, which is now on gordonzola.net. When I started it, it wasn't a cheese blog at all. It was just, whatever I happened to feel like writing about at the time. It was just kind of a fun writing project. But I noticed that every time I wrote about cheese, people would kind of go crazy. Like all of a sudden there'd be much more attention. And I made the mistake very early on of saying, well, does anybody have any cheese questions? And then all of a sudden, within a few hours, I had like 50 questions. I had to shut it down because I just didn't have the time to address those questions. And for me, this book was really an attempt to have a longer conversation with customers and with people who are interested in cheese than I'm able to behind the counter. I mean, it's still a retail environment when I'm working behind the counter. I can't talk for the equivalent of 10 pages about raw versus pasteurized milk or grass-fed or something like that. I just can't do it in that context. So it's really important for me to be able to kind of spell out the things that I'd always wanted to say, and that's kind of how the book project went. And it took a few years, but here it is. The first words in my book are, "This is not a guidebook." There's a lot of great guidebooks out there. This is not one of them. And my book is part memoir, part food politics book, and part cheese book. Like how does cheese get made? What's interesting about cheese? How it gets sold? All these things. And I kind of meld them all together. They kind of alternate during the course of, telling my story. I'll tell the story of how I got interested in cheese, tell the story of particular cheeses. I even recommend a few cheeses here and there. And, I think that's why people have really been, surprisingly to me, been really interested in the book. It's already exceeded my expectations in terms of interest, which makes me really happy. It makes me feel like I did the right thing. One of the things that really interests me about cheese is the way that it's sold and marketed, partially because I work at a worker-owned cooperative and we can have a little more critique of typical, sales. It interests me that there's a lot of terms that are used for cheese that don't have much meaning or have more meaning or have less meaning than people actually think that they do. So there's a few terms. Like one is organic. Now, organic actually means something. It's a certified term, and we might critique it and the fact that it is not strong enough for a lot of us, what a lot of us would want. But the fact is it has certain meanings. It's about how you can feed the animals. It now is about access to pasture. It's now, it defines a bunch of things which the milk has to be in order to be called organic. And so that, to me is a very positive thing, even though, like I said, I wish it was stronger sometimes. But there's a lot of other terms that people throw around. Artisan is one. Artisan is a term, I always laughed when I heard artisan. I always thought like Monty Python, like, Holy Grail, when all the peasants are rolling around in the dirt. And that's what I think of artisan. But what it means, it was a really effective term for small producers to use for a while, because it differentiated them from the large producers. It was like, we're doing this by hand. We're crafting this cheese. And it had a lot of meaning. At this point, boy, I don't remember the last time somebody told me didn't call themselves an artisan when they tried to sell cheese to me, no matter who it was. I think the final straw for me was when I saw some Jack in the Box commercial that was talking about artisan ciabatta bread, when I was like, okay, I'll never say the word artisan again, seriously. Another term is local. When we talk about local products, and a lot of us really want to support the local farms, local communities, cheese is pretty good with local things because there's only a certain number of ingredients, but it's also not quite as clear as people think it is. Mostly with cow's milk, the milk is pooled. So, you might know the address of the place they make the cheese, but it might be a radius of a couple hundred miles or maybe even more, where that milk comes from. That's not the worst thing in the world, but it's just important to know, especially if you're one of those people who has like an arbitrary number that this is my local area. Because, the milk that makes the cheese might not come from that arbitrary circle that you've drawn. It's more complicated when you get into sheep and goat cheese, especially in this country. A lot of times, goat cheese producers will buy frozen curd because the nature of goat dairy farming is that you're not going to have much milk in the beginning of the year. All the goats are kidding. They're having babies. There's just not enough milk available. So a lot of times people will, if they have a surplus, they'll maybe freeze their own milk, but otherwise they might buy it from somewhere, and that stuff might be from Canada, it might be from Wisconsin, it might be from Israel. You just don't know where it's from. And a lot, I think a little more effort needs to be put into labeling with those kind of issues. Farmstead is another term that people use for cheese, and that's generally, especially if you're looking for local cheese, it's a good term, because farmstead means that the operation has its own animals, the milk comes only from those animals, and the cheese is made on premises. Great, it's local, where the milk comes from. The only thing I'd say about that is there's no requirement there about the care or handling of the animals. How much room do they have? You could have, a 10,000 cow farm that would make farmstead cheese. You don't really know with that term. So all these terms are a little bit incomplete. And the other one I want to talk about is grass-fed. And this is something that's actually a really confusing issue to most people, because the meat industry has defined grass-fed. There's a USDA regulation about using grass-fed in terms of meat. It's not so in the dairy world. So people who say their cheese is grass-fed, generally speaking right now, most of the people who are selling cheese as grass-fed are good, honest people doing the right kind of farming we all like to support. In the future, I don't know if there's a guarantee of that without some kind of regulation about what grass-fed dairy means. I think that the future of cheese is really kind of bright right now. I think that the amount of, especially American, small production, high-quality cheese is just growing astronomically. I've been a judge a few times at the American Cheese Society and other events, and just the entries have skyrocketed. I think the first time I went to the conference, I wasn't a judge, but the first time I went to the conference, I think there was about 300 cheeses, and now there's more like 1,300 cheeses being entered, and those are just American cheeses. I think a lot of people are making a lot of really great cheese, and right now I don't see any signs of that slowing down. There's just more and more. In fact, I could use some more space in the store to fit all the great new cheeses that are coming out. So hopefully, hopefully people will really pick up on the new ones, be still open to new cheeses, and be interested in finding new farmers and new cheese makers and to try out.